Hey guys, welcome to class. Today we're going to be doing lesson 1.7 on multiplying and dividing integers. So make sure you turn to this page in your notes. And we have recently been working on adding and subtracting positive and negative numbers. And so now today we're going to add in two new operations, multiplying and dividing. Now the nice thing is, no matter what operation we're doing, we always start with the same question. So just like with addition and subtraction, as we multiply integers, we're going to start with the question of, do the numbers have the same sign or do they have different signs? However, how we respond when we're dealing with multiplication is going to be different than how we responded when we had addition and subtraction. So let's first talk through the rules, and then we're going to talk through why they make sense. So the product of two integers with the same sign, in other words, if they are both positive or both negative, is always going to be positive. So 2 times 4, obviously we know 2 positives is positive. We've been doing that for a while. But 2 negatives multiplied together is also positive. So -2 times -4 is positive 8. Now that's a little bit confusing, and that's obviously different than addition because we've just spent some time adding, and we know that if we add 2 negatives, we end up with a negative. But what we're saying now is if you multiply 2 negatives, you actually end up with a positive number. And in just a moment, we're going to talk about why that makes sense. So then the opposite is true, that if you're multiplying 2 integers that have different signs, in other words, one is positive and one is negative, then it will always be negative. Now, this rule is nice for people and a little bit easier than when we're dealing with addition and subtraction, because when we were dealing with addition and subtraction, we had to really think through like which one was negative and was it the one closer to 0 or further from 0 and all of that. With multiplication, if one of them is positive and one is negative, the answer is always negative. It doesn't matter if the negative number is first or second, if the negative number is bigger or smaller, if the negative number has the larger absolute value or the smaller absolute value. None of that matters when you're multiplying. If one of the numbers is positive and one of the numbers is negative, then when you multiply, the answer will be negative. So 2 times -4 is -8. And -2 times +4 is also -8. And then the last rule is that the product of any integer and 0 is always 0. And 0 can't be positive or negative. It's the only number that's not positive or negative. So whether you multiply it by +2 or -2, the answer is still 0. All right, so before we work some of these problems out, let's take just a minute and I'm going to try to help you understand why these rules work. Because again, we don't want to just memorize these rules, we want to understand why they work. So for just a moment, put your pen or stylus down, and I want you to just listen and follow along as I talk through this. All right, so I'm going to use some number lines here to help me. Now, the first thing that we need to review real quick when it comes to multiplication is that if you remember, multiplication is just repeated addition. So if I gave you the problem 3 times 2, we could either think about that as 3 plus 3, as in 2 groups of 3, or 2 plus 2 plus 2. It's 3 groups of 2, and that's what 3 times 2 means. And so if we thought about this on a number line, and we had a little person who's standing at 0, and he's moving this direction because that's the positive direction. If he were to take 3 steps that are 2 in length, that would be like 1, 2, 3, and he would end up at 6. And again, that's what multiplication is it's repeated addition. It's groups of the same thing. Okay, so in this problem, we're assuming that he is taking 3 steps or moving 3 groups that are each 2 in length. You could assume like 2 feet for the sake of this example, okay? All right, so now let's look at what happens here when we start adding in negatives. So in this first example, we had the little guy here, and he was facing forward, and he was moving forward. There you see his little face. And we know that when we start dealing with negatives, we've already talked about when we look at this on the number line, it changes direction. So we've talked about like if you add a negative, you move left instead of right, even though you're adding, but because it's negative, it changes the direction. So if we thought about this as like 3 times negative 2, well, we'd still have our little man here. And he is going to be facing this direction, all right, because he's facing the positive direction. But this time, he's moving groups of -2, okay? So this would mean he's taking steps in the other direction. And notice there, he ends up at -6. Well, the other way we could think about this is if the 3 was negative, but the 2 was positive, well, really, we could have this guy face the other direction. Because if one thing is negative, if he's facing this direction, okay, so that would be in the negative direction. That's like if the 3 is negative, but he walks forward here, he would still end up at -6. In other words, he could either be facing forward and stepping backwards, or he could be facing backwards, stepping forwards. But if one of those things is negative, he ends up in the negative section. He ends up at -6. Okay, so again, whether he's moving backwards or facing backwards, if one thing is negative and the other is positive. So again, he's facing forwards, moving backwards, or facing backwards, moving forwards, we end up negative. And that's why it doesn't matter which of those is negative, if it's the 3 or the 2, in both scenarios, we end up at -6. But now, watch what happens if both are negative. In other words, this would be the scenario where our little man or woman he's facing backwards but stepping backwards. In other words, think he's facing the negative numbers, but he is stepping backwards. And look, he ends up at +6. If both things are negative, so if he's facing backwards and stepping backwards, you actually end up positive. Again, if he's on the number line and he's at 0 and he's facing the negative numbers, but then he's stepping backwards, he actually ends up positive. So if one of the things is negative, he ends up negative. But if both of them are negative, he actually ends up in the positive side of the number line. So hopefully that helps you understand a little bit better why when one thing is negative, the answer is negative, but if both numbers are negative, the answer actually ends up being positive. All right, so let's go ahead now and you can head back to your notes. So pick up your pen or stylus and let's practice a few here. So just like with addition and subtraction, as I said, the question that we start with is the same. So number 1, we're gonna ask same signs or different signs. And since they have the same signs, it's a negative times a negative, the answer will be positive. And then you multiply just like normal, 3 times 12 is 36. Number 2, we have different signs. One is positive and one is negative. That means my answer will be negative. On number 3, anything times 0 is always 0. It doesn't matter if you multiply by a positive or negative. Since 0 can't be positive or negative, the answer is always 0. On number 4, you'll notice there that we have different signs, a +7 and a -12. So my answer will be -84. Number 5, we have the same signs, so a negative times a negative is positive. Number 6, we have different signs. One of those is positive, one is negative. And again, remember, with multiplication, it doesn't matter which one's positive and which one's negative. If they have different signs, the answer is always negative. Number 7, we have another one with different signs, and so my answer is negative. Number 8, we have the same sign, so the answer is positive. So a lot of people, once they get the hang of it, actually think that multiplication and division is a little bit easier than addition and subtraction because the rules are a little bit more straightforward on these. All right, so why don't we pause the video real quick, and I would like you and your partner to try the next 4 problems, number 9 through 12. When you're ready, we'll press play again. All right, so check your answers with mine, and hopefully we're getting the hang of this more and more. So the next thing that I want to look at is what if we're multiplying more than just 2 numbers? Because this can be a little bit confusing. On number 13, we can be tempted to think, okay, well, when I look at those, they all 3 have the same sign, so the answer must be positive. And that's actually not what's going to happen here, because when we solve this, we need to think about them in pairs. All right, so the first 2 I look at and I ask same signs or different signs. And if I'm doing -5 times -10, those are the same signs, so we get positive 50. But now we're doing positive 50 times -4. Those have different signs, and so my final answer actually comes out to be negative. So when we talk about same signs and different signs, we're only looking at pairs of numbers, and we have to, when we have more than 2 numbers, look at them in pairs of 2 numbers at a time. Now, there are some patterns actually when we have more than 2 digits, and there's a question on your homework worksheet that's going to explore this a little bit more, where what if you have 3 negatives or 4 negatives or 5 negatives or 6 negatives. And I'll give you a hint. It has to do whether there is an even amount of negative signs or an odd amount of negative signs. And again, there's a problem on your homework that walks you through this. The next thing I want to point out about number 13 is, as we've talked about with addition, in multiplication, you can multiply these numbers in any order. So there are other ways that you could solve this problem. You could also do -4 times -5 first, and that gives you positive 20, and then multiply by -10, and that would give you -200. Or the other way you could solve this if you wanted to is you could take the -10 times the -4 to start, and that gives you positive 40, and then times -5, which would also be -200. So it doesn't matter which way you do it. Multiplication can happen in any order. All right, so then as we look at number 4, with this in mind, again, you could take this in any order. I'll go ahead and just start and go from left to right. So 8 times -9, those are different signs. And so I know my answer is going to be negative, and this would be -72. Then times positive 3. So now I have different signs again. Now 72 times 3, you might need to write out as you multiply there. I get -216. You also could have started with 8 times 3 and gotten 24 and then multiplied that by -9. That would be completely fine as well. So then the next one, number 15. Again, you can multiply this in any order you want. So I might here do my 2 negatives first, and then I would get 6 times positive 8, which comes out to be 48. But if you started and did 6 times -2, you would get -12, and then times -4 would also give you 48. So it really doesn't matter here, but just pay attention when you're asking same signs and different signs. Make sure you're only looking at 2 numbers at a time. All right, so that's multiplication. Now we're going to take just a moment to look at division. All right, so the really nice thing about multiplying and dividing is that the rules are exactly the same. And that's why we're going to do these on the same day, is that multiplying and dividing integers follows the exact same rules. So you could actually probably fill this in with me. The quotient of 2 integers with the same sign is positive, just like it was with multiplication. So in other words, a positive divided by a positive is positive. A negative divided by a negative is also positive. And then the quotient of 2 integers with different signs is negative. And again, just like with multiplication, it doesn't matter which one's positive and which one's negative. If one of them is positive and one of them is negative, the answer will always be negative. So negative 8 divided by 4 is negative 2, and 8 divided by negative 4 is also negative 2. And then the quotient of 0 and any non-zero integer is always 0. In other words, if you divide 0 by anything, you always get 0. And again, 0 is not positive or negative. All right, so let's try a few of these now. Okay, so just like all other operations, we're going to start by asking same signs or different signs. So on number 1, hopefully you see that these have different signs, so that means my answer will be negative. Number 2, they also have different signs, so my answer is negative. Number 3, they also have different signs, so my answer is negative. And notice I'm dividing just like normal. The big thing I need to pay attention to is if they have the same signs or different signs. Number 4 is the first one where they have the same signs, and so we know if they have the same signs, it's always positive. Number 5 has different signs, and so this would be negative. And number 6, 0 divided by anything is always 0, no matter what. So take just a moment right now, and why don't you try 7, 8, and 9. All right, I would imagine these are going pretty quickly. So number 7 should be negative 3 because they have different signs. Number 8 is negative 1 because they have different signs. And number 9 is positive 12 because those have the same signs. Number 10 also has the same signs, and that is going to be positive 4. Now, number 11 is the first one where we have 3. Just like multiplication, we're going to take it 2 at a time. But the difference is with division, you can't choose the order. Division has to stay in the order that it's in. So you have to solve this moving from left to right. You don't have a choice when it's division. So I need to start by doing negative 48 divided by negative 4. Those have the same sign, so it is positive. Then I divide by 3. And this is a positive divided by a positive, so that is going to be positive as well. And that is the only way that you can solve that one. All right. Now, number 12, we just have 2, and those are different signs, and so that's negative 5. But number 13 is another one where we have 3 values there. So again, we have to go from left to right. So I'm going to start by doing 6 divided by negative 1, which is negative 6. And then divide by 3, we still have different signs, so my answer is negative 2. But again, when you're asking same signs or different signs, you're looking at just 2 numbers at a time, and when it's division, you have to go from left to right. That's the only way you can solve it. All right, so this last one, we have different signs, that's negative 5, and number 15, 0 divided by anything is always 0. So hopefully that helps you know how to multiply and divide integers. That's all we got for today. Have a great day.